This video was brought to you by Brilliant. On Wednesday evening, French President Emmanuel Macron declared a state of emergency in the French overseas territory of New Caledonia, following announcements of a constitutional change that could reduce the political influence of the indigenous Kanak people. Violent riots and widespread fighting broke out between the poorer Kanak population, who are generally in favour of independence, and the wealthier French settler population, locally called Caledonia, or loyalists, who generally want to stay part of France. So in this video, we're going to take a look at New Caledonia's ongoing constitutional crisis, Macron's proposed reforms, and why local officials fear a civil war. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. First though, a bit of context. New Caledonia is an archipelago colonised by France in 1853 that lies off the coast of eastern Australia, roughly 10,400 miles away from what's sometimes called metropolitan France, i.e. mainland France. And to understand the current process, you need to know about two key things: New Caledonia's demographic profile and its voting system. Let's start with its demography. Following a nickel boom in the early 70s, Paris encouraged more and more migration from metropolitan France to develop New Caledonia's nickel industry, and at least according to Kanak nationalists, to simultaneously gradually outnumber the Kanaks in order to preserve French sovereignty over the island. At the same time, people from other poorer countries around New Caledonia, including Indonesia, Vietnam, and French Polynesia, also began immigrating to the island, hoping to find work. What particularly attracted these immigrants to the island was that its political union with France and the heavy subsidies that it receives from the mainland had made New Caledonia one of the wealthier islands in the region. For context, today New Caledonia has a GDP per capita of about $35,700, the fourth largest in Oceania, and only slightly less than France itself. These migrants often end up working on farms set up by French settlers, which strained relations with the local Kanak people. This heavy influx of economic migrants meant that by the end of 1983, of the 145,000 residents in New Caledonia, 42% were Kanaks, 37% were Europeans, and 21% were other Polynesian and Asian ethnic groups who had mostly migrated for work. Now, to this day, the Kanaks still are the largest single nationality in New Caledonia, but they've clearly been unable to achieve their political aspirations because most of the Polynesian and Asian migrants tended to vote with the loyalists. Now, this is for a variety of reasons, including the fact that migrants largely saw themselves as dependent on the French settlers for jobs and land, and that they apparently attribute New Caledonia's relative wealth to French support. As a result, Kanak nationalists, largely represented by the Kanak Socialist and Nationalist Liberation Front, started demanding electoral reform that would restrict the vote to solely Kanaks, or at least disenfranchised voters who had arrived relatively recently. From their point of view, a restricted electoral roll would compensate for what they regarded as their artificially induced minority status by French immigration policies, and would ensure a pro-independence vote. However, their demands were continuously rejected by Paris, and in November 1984, confrontations between the Kanak and Caledonia populations had become so violent that the French government had to send more than 6,000 gendarmes to keep the peace. By late April 1988, roadblocks, gun battles, and the destruction of property culminated in the Ovia cave hostage-taking, where barely a fortnight before the French presidential elections, 22 gendarmes, a magistrate, and an army officer were taken hostage as part of the Kanaks' effort to draw attention to their demands. And while all the hostages were freed, 24 Kanak militants and 4 gendarmes were killed. To put an end to the violence, in 1998, both sides signed the Noumea Accords, which set the groundwork for a 20-year transition to greater political autonomy for the island, and restricted the voting franchise to Kanaks and citizens who lived in the territory before the agreement. The accord also allowed for 3 referendums to determine the future of the country at the end of the transition period. Then, 20 years later, the first 2 referendums were held, in 2018 and 2020, and in both cases, a narrow majority voted against independence. Again, if we look at the distribution of votes, we can see that there's a very clear correlation between the distribution of those who voted for independence and the Kanak population. Now, a third and final referendum was due to be held in December 2021, but Kanak nationalists requested it was postponed due to COVID, which was having a disproportionate impact on the poorer Kanak population. However, loyalists rejected this and accused pro-independence campaigners of using the pandemic to delay the referendum that they feared they'd lose. So, the referendum went ahead anyway, but was boycotted by the Kanaks, which meant that independence was rejected by 96%. Now, unsurprisingly, the pro-independence party rejected the vote, calling it a declaration of war and demanding a rerun, but they were basically ignored by Paris. French President Emmanuel Macron instead celebrated the results, adding that France is a more beautiful place because New Caledonia has decided to stay part of it. Now, having apparently won the independence argument, Paris then argued that the current policy of only allowing Kanaks to vote in local elections, as dictated by the Nouméa Accords, is undemocratic. So, after 25 years, Macron is now planning to expand the electoral list, which will allow French Europeans who've lived on the island for more than 10 years to vote in the local elections. Now, of course, this hasn't gone down well with the Kanak population, who fear that this change will dilute their political influence yet further. So, ever since the constitutional changes were announced last month, there have been regular protests. But things took a deadly turn this week, with an escalation of violence matching the intensity last seen in the 80s. According to the French commissioner in New Caledonia, 54 police officers and gendarmes were injured in overnight riots. More than 120 people were arrested, 300 injured, and at least 3 young Kanaks and 1 gendarme were killed. Authorities then put a curfew in place on Tuesday, closing the international airport, banning public gatherings, banning TikTok, shutting diplomatic premises, and even declaring a state of emergency the following day. Unsurprisingly then, ethnic tensions are now at a dangerous high, with Kanaks clamoring for greater independence and local anti-independence politicians claiming that a race war is being perpetrated against the European population by the Kanaks. And all of this begs the question, how will this all end? Well, the High Commissioner and a former leading anti-independence minister have both said that the situation is entering a dangerous spiral, which could end in civil war, which is especially worrying given that both sides are heavily armed. Nonetheless, there is sign for cautious optimism. Leaders of the independence group have condemned the violence, and Macron has invited both camps to negotiations in Paris, offering to abandon the electoral changes if the two sides agree to a new criteria for citizenship. However, it is hard to see the two sides coming to an agreement before Macron's stated deadline of late June, given that they've been arguing about this for decades, which means the risk for further escalation remains high for now at least. Ultimately underpinning this topic is a lot of data, whether that's economics, trade patterns, polling, or demographics. A lot of the time with politics, you just have to understand the data. So if you want to get a better grasp on these kind of things, I'd recommend Brilliant. And they've just introduced a whole bunch of new data courses, which are perfect for learners of any level, taking you through everything from Bayes' theorem to multiple linear regression. It even uses real data sets from the likes of Starbucks, X, and Spotify in order to bring things to life. I'm not even a super mathematical person, and I still found it easy and enjoyable to work through. And that's because of how Brilliant is designed, built around learning by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. The good thing is that, like I mentioned earlier, you can learn all of these things quickly and easily because Brilliant's courses are split into easy-to-digest chunks. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in just minutes a day, with fun lessons that you can do whenever you have time, replacing mindless scrolling on the train or while waiting for coffee with something actually stimulating and rewarding. So get learning across all kinds of STEM subjects for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.